There's a story we tell men. It's a story whispered from the moment we're born, reinforced in movies, music, and 1,000 quiet conversations. It's the story of a great prize waiting at the end of a man's journey. Before a man can be broken, before he becomes compliant, before his life path becomes utterly predictable, he is first sold on a beautiful, powerful idea that love will be his salvation, that marriage is the key that will finally complete him, that by obeying the rules of society, he will be protected. And if you ask me, this story, this promise, it's the single greatest and most subtle scam civilization has ever pulled. Forget the grand dramas of war or the complex doctrines of religion. The most effective con is the one that convinces a free man to chain himself, to wrap that chain in silk and lace, and to proudly call it commitment. But what if someone saw through it all? What if there was a man who looked at this entire arrangement, this grand social contract, and just laughed? Well, there was. And his name was Diogenes of Sinope. This wasn't just some disgruntled academic. This was a man who, by all accounts, lived like a wild animal in the heart of civilized Athens. He was the man who famously told Alexander the Great, the most powerful man on earth, to get out of his sunlight. He was the man who spat in the face of decorum and laughed out loud, while the most brilliant philosophers of his day debated the abstract meaning of virtue. Why? What gave him this incredible audacity? It's simple. He saw the world for exactly what it was. A massive stage, filled to the brim with actors. And in his eyes, the most tragic actors of all were the men pretending to be free while wearing the invisible shackles of domestic life. You see, Diogenes didn't just reject the institution of marriage. He held it up to the light and ridiculed it. Not because he was some bitter misogynist who hated women, but because he refused, on principle, to sacrifice his one and only life to an illusion. He saw a fundamental truth that most men today are still too terrified to even admit to themselves in the dead of night. Marriage as an institution is not a reward for your hard work and sacrifice. It's a leash disguised in lace, presented as a trophy, and the moment it's fastened around your neck, everything that makes you you suddenly becomes negotiable. Your time, it's no longer your own. Your peace of mind, it's subject to the emotional weather of another person. Your grand purpose, the fire that drives you, that gets downsized, reprioritized, and filed away under household responsibilities. Even the very core of your masculine energy is expected to be tamed, softened, and made safe. There's a legendary story about him that perfectly captures his philosophy. One day, he saw a young boy cupping water in his hands to drink. In that instant, Diogenes threw away his own wooden cup, one of his few possessions, and said, "A child has beaten me in simplicity of living." He realized the cup was an unnecessary attachment, a complication he didn't need. Now, pause and think about that. He threw away a simple cup. Imagine what he would say if he saw modern men willingly throwing away their ambition, their autonomy, their very fire, all for the social validation of being called a good husband. Diogenes never needed a wedding ring to feel whole. He didn't require the affection of a romantic partner to validate his existence or his identity. The man literally lived in a ceramic barrel in the middle of the marketplace. He had no wife, no possessions to speak of, and zero social status. But he possessed the one thing that nearly every settled, successful, married man eventually begins to mourn, whether he admits it or not: total, unshakable, uncompromising autonomy. His mind was his kingdom, and he was its only sovereign. From his barrel, he had a front-row seat to the great human comedy. He watched as powerful men paraded their wives around like status symbols, only to whisper to their friends later about how miserable they were. He listened as philosophers delivered eloquent speeches about logic and reason, all while being secretly crushed under the silent, emotional tyranny of their domestic lives. And Diogenes would just laugh. Not a cruel laugh, but the laugh of a man who sees the profound absurdity of it all. He once asked, "Of what use is a philosopher who doesn't hurt anybody's feelings?" He saw that true wisdom had to be disruptive. It had to be dangerous to comfortable lies. To Diogenes, getting married was a fundamental act of surrender. It was the trading of one's soul in exchange for social approval. And he would ask, what is a man really worth when he barters his own spirit just for a little peace and quiet? When he spiritually neuters himself just to be deemed acceptable in the eyes of a woman and the society that props her up? Fast forward 2,000 years, and our society still hasn't caught up to his way of thinking. In fact, we've doubled down on the same old story. We tell young men that a good wife will refine them, that starting a family will focus them, that the power of a woman's love will discipline them into a greater version of themselves. Diogenes, who was nicknamed the dog for his shameless, animal-like existence, would have barked back at that nonsense. Greatness does not need to be house-trained. A wildfire does not need to be contained in a fireplace. The man who must be tamed to be respected was never a formidable man to begin with. Let's be brutally honest for a second. What is marriage really, when you strip away the poetry and the ceremony? It is a state-sanctioned contract that legally binds you to a lifetime of obligations to another person. A person whose feelings, desires, and goals are guaranteed to change over time, just like your own. A man signs a piece of paper thinking he's capturing a feeling, securing love for all time. In reality, he is volunteering for a lifetime of slow, creeping emotional and financial servitude. The terms and conditions are endless, and they are not written in his favor. Diogenes had a special talent for theatrical mockery. He once humiliated the great Plato in his own academy. Plato had defined man, rather smugly, as a featherless biped. It was a neat, academic, and utterly sterile definition. So, what did Diogenes do? He found a chicken, plucked all its feathers off, and stormed into Plato's lecture hall, holding up the squawking, naked bird and shouting, "Behold, Plato's man!" He exposed the definition as a hollow absurdity with a single dramatic act. Now, if Diogenes were alive today, can you imagine where he'd pull a stunt like that? He wouldn't need to go to a university. He'd walk straight into a modern wedding ceremony. He'd wait for that moment when the groom is standing at the altar, puffed up in his rented tuxedo, smiling for the cameras. And Diogenes would point, not with malice, but with a kind of brutal pity, and say, "Behold, the modern featherless biped, a domesticated slave who genuinely believes he is a king." What makes this philosophy so explosive, so fundamentally dangerous to the status quo, is that it doesn't just mock our sacred traditions. It ruthlessly exposes the hidden price tag of obedience. It peels back the curtain on the slow, psychological mutilation that men are expected to endure in exchange for being called responsible by a culture that would much rather see them tamed than see them truly awakened. Diogenes teaches a stark and uncomfortable lesson. You cannot truly belong to a woman, to a family, to a corporation, and still belong to yourself. Eventually, one of those allegiances has to crack. And tragically, most men will break themselves into 1,000 little pieces just to keep their marriage, their public image intact. How does this happen? It's not a single violent event. It's a slow, quiet erosion. They start by shrinking their goals. That dream of starting a business, or traveling the world, or mastering a difficult skill. It gets put on the back burner for a more sensible life. Then, they muzzle their own instincts. That raw, masculine edge, that directness, that unapologetic drive, it gets sanded down, softened, made more agreeable, less intimidating. They learn to laugh a little quieter. They argue a little less. They sleep a little worse. They slowly, piece by piece, become a ghost with a mortgage, a polite, reliable zone, and hollowed-out shell of the man they once were. But Diogenes chose the exact opposite path. He chose to sleep under the stars, to walk barefoot through the city, to eat whatever he could find or was given. And you have to understand, he didn't do this because he couldn't afford comfort. He did it because he couldn't afford captivity. He understood a vital truth that modern men have been conditioned to forget. It is infinitely better to be alone and sovereign in your truth than to be partnered in a comfortable illusion. The critical question isn't, can a woman love me? The real question, the one that Diogenes would force you to ask is, can you still love and respect yourself after you've handed over the keys to your time, your peace, and your inner fire just to be granted access to her life? He would look at a man begging for a woman's approval and ask a simple, devastating question. Why beg for a scrap of love when you can walk freely in a feast of your own sovereignty? And perhaps that's the real reason so many people, especially today, find his philosophy so uncomfortable. He didn't just reject marriage. He rejected the entire underlying premise that a woman's affection should be the ultimate measure of a man's worth. He metaphorically pissed on the pedestal that men are taught to build. He barked at the audience that demands men perform. And in doing so, he reminded every man watching that true dignity begins the very moment you stop needing to be chosen. You see, Diogenes didn't just challenge the rules, he challenged the reason for the rules. Why must a man get married? Why is he culturally obligated to attach himself to one woman, one household, one rigid structure that implicitly demands he bleed silently while smiling publicly? The answer is fear. Society is terrified of the man who needs nothing. A man who can walk alone, sleep alone, think for himself, and bow to no one is a glitch in the matrix. He is dangerously unpredictable. And unpredictability is a mortal threat to a social system that runs on the fuel of male sacrifice. A man who isn't chasing a wife is a man who isn't desperately working a job. He hates to buy things he doesn't need to impress people who don't care. He's a loose cannon. That's why the institution of marriage is wrapped in layers of holiness, of breathless sentiment, of beautiful poetry. It has to be. Because if men ever saw the arrangement for what it truly is, a contract for a life of slow spiritual erosion, the entire charade would collapse overnight. Diogenes once saw a procession of men being led to their wedding ceremony and remarked dryly, "Look at the poor sheep being led to the slaughter." Now, he wasn't saying this because he believed women were evil predators. He said it because he knew that most men were blind. Blind to their own conditioning. Blind to the desperate need for validation that had been programmed into them since boyhood. Blind to how their very desire to be loved is weaponized to make them weak, compliant, and easily controlled. And make no mistake, nothing controls a man more effectively than the fear of being unloved and alone. That one fear is the lever that can turn lions into lapdogs. It transforms conquerors into caretakers. It silences the fire in a man's belly and rewards him for his quiet, obedient service. And standing right at the center of this transformation is often the woman you have sworn to call your wife. The one person who legally and socially holds the power to claim half your wealth, all your energy, and the majority of your attention, simply because you signed a contract at a time in your life when you were most desperate to feel loved and accepted. Diogenes would have spit on such a contract. He understood the psychology of it perfectly. He saw how men are raised from the ground up to be useful, to be a good boy, a good student, a good worker, a good provider. So when the opportunity to marry finally arrives, the programming kicks in. They think, finally, this is my reward. Finally, I will be accepted. Finally, I will be enough. But here's the secret Diogenes knew in his bones. You were already enough. You were born complete. It was the world that told you a lie. The lie that you were a half person, wandering the earth looking for your other half to make you whole. Diogenes was the living, breathing antidote to that lie. He needed no one's approval, not from the state, not from a woman, not even from the great Plato. And this, ironically, is what made him the freest man in all of Athens. A man with no home, no career, and no wife, who was somehow more alive, more awake, than all the well-fed, respected husbands who spent their days arguing about virtue and their nights choking on unspoken regret. Because deep down, most of them know. They know they've made a trade. They can't quite put a name to it, but they feel its absence. It's a quiet humming of loss, a silence that gets heavier with each passing year. It's the ghost of the man they could have been, the man they abandoned in order to be a good man, a good husband, a good provider, a good, hollow ghost. Diogenes reminds us that it is better to live a life that earns no applause, as long as it's a life free from the need for it. And maybe that's why his legacy, his legend, has survived for centuries. Not because he built any empires of stone or gold, but because he refused to let one be built inside of him. You have to understand that, from the perspective of Diogenes, marriage isn't a partnership, it's an empire. But the empire isn't built for you. It's built for her security, for her comfort, for her peace of mind. And in the construction of this empire, you are assigned a role. You become the mule, expected to carry the heavy loads without faltering. You become the shield, expected to absorb the blows from the outside world. And you become the silent stone statue in the center of the garden, expected to weather every storm, financial, emotional, spiritual, without ever showing a crack, without ever complaining. And what happens if you dare to speak of the weight? What if you admit that the shield is dented, that your back is breaking? You're immediately hit with a barrage of accusations. You're ungrateful. You're weak. You're not man enough. You're toxic. The very system you are sacrificing everything to uphold turns on you, revealing its teeth the moment you stop being a silent, efficient machine. Diogenes would have barked at that accusation. He would have laughed in the face of anyone calling him toxic for speaking a raw truth. This is precisely why he behaved so outrageously, why he defecated in public, why he mocked sacred rituals. He saw that the more civilized a man becomes, the more he is enslaved by things that simply do not matter: appearances, status, and the opinions of others. He saw the polished, groomed, respectable man of Athens and knew that, beneath the clean toga, the man was dying inside. His life had become a checklist of expectations, a list written by people who would never have to carry the weight he did. Diogenes pissed on that checklist and kept walking. He wanted the truth, the raw, unfiltered, and often ugly truth of what it means to be a man, stripped of all pretense. A man who owes nothing. A man who answers to no one. And most critically, a man who does not trade his inner peace for external approval. Because that trade is always rooted in fear. Marriage, above all other social contracts, is a defense mechanism against fear. The fear of dying alone. The fear of being judged by your peers. The fear of being forgotten. But most of all, the crippling fear of being unloved. Diogenes lived his life like a man who had already faced those fears and transcended them. He didn't just stop caring about public opinion, he achieved a state beyond caring. While other men were performing, waiting for a woman's permission to feel whole, he simply declared himself complete. Not out of arrogance, but out of a profound and simple clarity. The clarity that comes when you strip life down to its absolute essence. In his world, there was no middle ground. You are either free or you are domesticated. So when we tell men today that marriage will elevate them, that it's a step up in life, Diogenes would let out that cynical, knowing laugh. He'd tell you that you cannot rise while carrying the weight of another person's world on your back. He would tell you that every promise you make out of desperation is just another link in a chain you are forging yourself, forged in the fire of your own weakness. He would ask a question that cuts to the very core of the modern obsession with partnership. Why do you, a man with only one life to live, need an audience to convince you that it's real? Because that's what so much of modern life, and especially marriage, has become. A ritual of performance. You wear the right suit, you speak the rehearsed vows, and you present a carefully curated illusion of perfect love to an audience that is far more concerned with appearances than with substance. Yet beneath all the celebration lies the cold, hard text of a contract. A contract of obligation, of mutual surveillance, and for many men, a contract for a slow decay of the self. And it is men who are socially and legally expected to bear the brunt of that contract's failure. You work, you provide, you sacrifice. You are the dependable rock, even when your own soul is turning to sand. And if you ever dare to crumble, emotionally, financially, physically, the very structure you held up collapses on top of you, armed with legal force and social shame. Diogenes wanted no part of that game. He knew what most men learn far too late. Society has absolutely no interest in the flourishing of a man who refuses to comply. And marriage is the final, ultimate test of your compliance. If you pass, you are rewarded with shallow praise. If you fail, you are punished with total ruin. This is why he lived without shame. He refused to borrow his sense of worth from anyone else. And that is what made him so dangerous. Not because he was violent or loud, but because he didn't need a wife, a child, a salary, or a round of applause to justify his existence. He was self-contained, self-validated. He was a completed sentence all by himself. And that is the rarest and most powerful kind of man. Because make no mistake, comfort is the currency that marriage trades in. But the price of that comfort is your sovereignty. You'll be told, subtly or overtly, where to live, how to spend your money, how to act. You'll be told what's appropriate, what's offensive, and what's acceptable, all under the gentle tyranny of love. But Diogenes never believed in a love that came with terms and conditions. For him, a love that sought to control, consume, or demand the sacrifice of the self was not love at all. It was ownership. So to the men who are listening to this, the message isn't to go live in a barrel. It's to adopt the mind of the man who did. Start questioning everything. Question the narratives you've been force-fed about love, sacrifice, and duty. Ask yourself honestly if the life you are building is truly yours, or if it's a performance written by someone else. Because once a man truly wakes up, once he sees the chains he willingly put on himself in the name of love, there is no going back. He can no longer unsee the bars of the cage. Diogenes didn't write books. He scrawled his philosophy on the walls of life with piss and laughter. And in what the world called his madness, there was a rare and potent wisdom. The wisdom is this: you were never broken. You were simply convinced that you were incomplete. You were programmed to chase the very thing that was designed to soften you, to domesticate you, to make you dependent. A man deeply in love can be a beautiful and powerful thing, but a man married to obligation is a man enslaved. Diogenes teaches us to return to our raw, sovereign state, to reclaim the mind that was conditioned to chase approval, to live not in accordance with what society desires from you, but with the reason that screams what your heart fears to admit. If you must lose yourself to be loved by another, it was never love to begin with. So when they call you bitter, or lonely, or lost for choosing your own path, remember Diogenes. He was called a dog. He was ridiculed by the greatest minds of his time, and he died as the freest man in Greece. Let them laugh. The man who needs no approval is the only kind of man worth becoming.